Hi, my name is Keith Chomantowski, Senior Trainer with Blue Coat Systems, and today we're going to talk a little bit about configuring and understanding how an integrated Windows authentication realm works with the ProxySG. Very specifically, we're going to be looking at an IWA direct realm today. And before we get started, probably a good idea that we look at a little bit of deployment planning. A couple of things that are going to be important. Understand the current load that you have with your proxy environment, CPU, memory, transactions per second, as well as the domain that you're on. When we start doing authentication, based on the method we choose to do authentication, we may be putting extra load on the systems. It's important to do a little bit of baselining so that when we do implement auth, we can see the effects from a performance standpoint. Some other information that you're going to need, details about the domain we're going to be joining. The proxy should be configured to use DNS and NTP, similar to your other domain members. We, in the case of IWA Direct, again, will be joining the domain, so we want to make sure that we can reach out to DNS and that there's no time sync issues. So very important that we double check the NTP and DNS settings on the proxy. There are some ports that we need to communicate, and you can see those on the screen here. These ports are to communicate with the domain: DNS, Kerberos, LDAP, and port 445 SMB calls for Windows. As you can see, there's an FAQ that kind of repeats the information there. Another thing that's pretty important to think about is how are you deployed, explicit or transparent? We're not going to go into the details of how explicit and transparent authentication works today, but it is an important aspect. Since the authentication mechanisms in explicit and transparent mode are quite different, again, it's something to be aware of before we start talking about authentication on the ProxySG appliance. Load balancing is also something in many cases that has to be taken into consideration. There's a very simple KB 4808. Specifically with IWA Direct load balancing. And then the last two things I see as most important, not only from a security but also from a performance perspective. When clients are going to be presenting their Windows credentials across the wire to the proxy, we should be concerned a little bit about security. Some of the processes to pass those credentials are fairly secure, NTLM. Some are very secure, Kerberos, and some are not secure at all in the case of BASIC. We're going to look at some demonstrations of this a little bit later once we set up the realm. Also the concept of a surrogate. How often are we going to authenticate the end user? A surrogate essentially is a replacement for credentials. So what's possible on the ProxySG appliance is to have a connection surrogate. This is default behavior with explicit clients, where every new TCP connection is challenged and the user agent or client machine presents the credentials over and over again to the SG appliance. To cut down on authentication, and in some cases in transparent mode, we must use a cookie or an IP as a surrogate to prove that we've authenticated in the past. So in cases where we do use an IP surrogate, we would authenticate the first TCP connection, and then any future TCP connection for the next 15 minutes by default will assumed to be authenticated, or that specific user who authenticated or presented credentials during the first connection. So these are all things to take into consideration to have a successful IWA Direct deployment. Now let's go to the GUI. So in this demonstration, I'll be running SGOS 6521, the proxy edition. And the first thing we need to do is just check on our NTP server. It looks like I need to hook into an NTP server that the domain is using. So we want to make sure and create the NTP server, promote it to the top. We're going to apply that change. going to go to the clock tab and actually acquire UTC time. Again, this is important within Active Directory to avoid any type of time sync errors. The SG should be using the same NTP server as the domain controller. At this point, I'll double check my DNS settings, make sure that I am pointed to a local DNS server. In most cases, we're going to be demonstrating explicit authentication with IWA Direct. In most cases, the browser is pointed to the host name of the proxy or load balancer, and the proxy is registered within local DNS. I'm going to set up some services, and this will allow the proxy to intercept traffic, apply policy to it, authentication, etc. So again, for today's demonstration, we'll strictly be using explicit mode. And since this is a freshly configured machine, I'm going to go in and change the default policy to allow. Okay, now on to authentication. Again, these are not requirements. The default policy, turning on services, that's going to be unique to your environment. At any rate, let's go into authentication. Now, with IWA Direct, the idea is that the proxy now is going to join the domain. If it's joined the domain, it's a domain member, we can utilize the Windows APIs that are needed to authenticate end users. So the first step here will be, under authentication, add a new domain. We do support the ability to join multiple domains. The important thing here is trust. Okay? Whatever domain the proxy is going to join into, as long as our users are coming from that domain or a trusted domain, we can successfully authenticate them. When there's not trust between domains, we may need to set up additional IWA Direct realms and additional domains on the proxy appliance. In this case, we just have a single domain. So I put in the domain name. I'm going to go ahead and click Apply. And now we join the domain. When we attempt to join the domain, we can join as a very specific host name if I've pre-registered the proxy in DNS, or we will create a host name within the domain. What's going to happen when I actually join is a computer account is set up in Active Directory. Okay? Not a user account, but a computer account. And that computer account and the account password potentially, in the case of Kerberos, is going to be used to create some session tickets. Now, when I join the domain, I need to know the DNS domain name, in our case sg1.lab, and I need Windows credentials to join into the domain. Now, these credentials don't need any special rights, so I'm just going to use a generic account within my domain here. Put in the password and say OK. Now, if we have successfully joined the domain, we will get a nice little message like this: domain joined successfully, and say OK. Otherwise, we may receive some sort of error message. And from experience, one of the main things is a time sync error. That's when the proxy time is off from the Windows time. So if we get any type of error regarding time sync, probably a good idea to go check the actual time on the proxy and compare that to the actual domain time. Of course, mistyping the username and password could also respond with an error. But at this point, we have successfully joined the domain, and the next step is to actually create the authentication realm. So I'll go to Authentication and IWA, and we're going to create New. Now, IWA stands for Integrated Windows Authentication. It allows the proxy to reach out to Active Directory or native NT domains and invalidate user credentials. So I give it a domain or a realm name. I say OK, and I click Apply. At this point, we've joined into the domain. We've set up our authentication realm. We may need a little extra configuration of the realm, which I'm going to show you next. And then the next step would be to actually create policy. Okay, now that our domain is created, let's go to the IWA Servers tab. There is a drop-down at the top of the screen. If we have multiple domains, settings on this screen are unique to the IWA realm that we have selected. A couple of important things on the screen here. Client authentication modes. Again, spoke about this briefly in the introduction. This is how the client is going to present credentials to the proxy appliance. And there's three ways to do that over HTTP. What's called basic, NTLM, and negotiate or Kerberos. Now the mode that you choose or choose to offer the clients, in this case I'm offering the client the ability to present Kerberos, NTLM, or basic credentials. The client user agent is responsible for selecting the most secure way to pass the credentials to the SG. So there is some responsibility on the side of the client. Those clients who don't support Kerberos or NTLM will still have the ability via a prompt to enter in basic credentials. For our demonstration today, I'm going to disable Kerberos and we'll take a look at NTLM. Probably a good idea when you're on the screen as well to test the configuration. Before we create policy and push traffic through the device to be authenticated, we want to make sure that the appliance can actually reach out to the domain. So I'm going to take a generic account within our domain and do a test. And as we can see, the test was successful, which means we can communicate with the domain. We can gather group membership and present the client credentials to the domain successfully. Now let's set up some policy. So since we have our proxy joined into the domain, we have a realm created, we can now enforce policy to say when and how to do authentication. And in this example, what I'll do is we'll create a web authentication layer. Web authentication layers allow us to, again, based on source or destination, on a granular or global basis, ask clients to authenticate. I'm going to right-click in the action column and choose Set and New. I'm going to select Authenticate, ensure that the proper realm is selected, and leave the mode at this time set to Auto. Go ahead and give the realm a name or the object. And say OK. Once we install policy, we're now forcing authentication to take place. From any source to any destination, we will force authentication to take place. So let's open up a browser and run through a quick test. I'm going to open up a packet capture here. And we'll also open up a browser that is explicitly proxy. Okay, so the first step will be open up the browser, and let's go to bluecoat.com. A couple of things we may notice. The user was not visually prompted. In the case of NTLM, when that's the authentication mechanism that's being used, the workstation and the browser work together to silently pass the credentials to the SG appliance in the background. Now, looking at our packet capture, I'm going to scroll all the way back up. Here is the request of bluecoat.com. Let's take a quick look at some of the headers, and specifically let's focus a little on NTLM itself. Here's my initial request to the proxy. You can see I send a GET request, and the proxy responds with a 407 proxy authentication required. This is a response code that's used for explicit clients. You can also see right below there the proxy-authenticate headers. So the proxy is offering NTLM or BASIC as a way for the client to pass their credentials. With explicit authentication, the out-of-the-box behavior essentially is to authenticate every new TCP connection. And that's why we might notice in this screen repeated attempts to authenticate. NTLM is also a three-way handshake, which causes a little more chit-chat on the wire. At any rate, what's important to notice here is the proxy is authenticating every new TCP connection using the NTLM challenge response mechanism. And there are ways to adjust this. In some cases, authenticating every TCP connection can just be too much from a performance perspective on the proxy and maybe even on the domain controller itself. By changing the authentication mode, what we can do is tell the proxy, in this case, the explicit proxy, to use a surrogate or a replacement for credentials. So I am now setting the mode to proxy IP and say OK. And I'm going to install. In this scenario, what we should notice is the first TCP connection, the user will be asked to present credentials. Future TCP connections over the next 15 minutes will assume to be authenticated because they're coming from that same IP address. Let me take a look at what users I currently have authenticated on the proxy and log any of those users out. Let's open up our packet capture. And let's see the effects of changing the mode and using an IP surrogate. I'm going to go back to bluecoat.com. Again, browser can silently pass the credentials in the background. And what we should notice now is the first request or first TCP connection is challenged for authentication. Once the client successfully provides credential information, the proxy stores that information and ties it to the client's IP address, hence the name proxy IP mode. The proxy appliance will keep that surrogate IP to username mapping for the next 15 minutes by default. Any future TCP connections and requests are assumed to be authenticated. This will greatly cut down on the authentication queries between client and proxy, and also the S-channel communication, the net logon communication between the proxy and the domain controller. So again, to recap very quickly, IWA direct authentication realms, good idea to check, prepare. We need to join a domain, create a realm, and then create policy to enforce the authentication. So to wrap things up, IWA Direct Deployment Planning, you can see the information on the screen. You can also find a lot of additional information at bto.bluecoat.com, kb.bluecoat.com, and forums.bluecoat.com. Thank you, and have a great day.